Welcome back, children. Now, let's continue with the chapter The Address by Maga Minko. This short story is a poignant account of a daughter who goes in search of her mother's belongings after the war in Holland. When she finds them, the objects evoke memories of her earlier life. However, she decides to leave them all behind and resolves to move on. So, children, this is a moving story of a daughter who goes in search of her mother's belongings after the war in Holland. The narrator is the daughter of Mrs. S, who died during the war. The narrator went to number 46 Marconi Street to see Mrs. Darling, who was an old acquaintance of her mother and who had removed almost all the belongings of her mother during the war to this place. All this was done with Mrs. S's silent consent, as Mrs. Darling wanted to save her things, which they would lose if they had to leave the place. "Do you still know me?" I asked. The woman looked at me searchingly. She had opened the door a chink. I came closer and stood on the step. "No, I don't know you. I am Mrs. S's daughter." She held her hand on the door as though she wanted to prevent it opening any further. Her face gave absolutely no sign of recognition. She kept staring at me in silence. Perhaps I was mistaken. I thought perhaps it isn't her. I'd seen her only once, fleetingly, and that was years ago. It was most probable that I had rung the wrong bell. The woman let go of the door and stopped to the side. She was wearing my mother's green knitted cardigan. The wooden buttons were rather pale from washing. She saw that I was looking at the cardigan and half hid herself again behind the door. But I knew now that I was right. "Well, you knew my mother?" I asked. "Have you come back?" said the woman. I thought that no one had come back, only me. So, as I told you, children, this is a story of a girl whose mother had died during the war, and the mother, Mrs. S, handed over all the belongings of her house to one of her acquaintances, that is, Mrs. Darling. When the war was over, the daughter of Mrs. S wants to get back the belongings. So she goes to check the belongings with Mrs. Darling. But Mrs. Darling fails to identify the girl. The narrator had seen Mrs. Darling for the first time during the first half of the war. She had come home for a few days and noticed the change in the room. She missed various things. Her mother informed her that Mrs. Darling had moved these things to safety and gave her the address 46 Marconi Street. Children, as Mrs. Darling was the acquaintance of Mrs. S, so Mrs. S gave all the belongings of her house to Mrs. Darling so that she would keep them safe. When the mother died, or I can say Mrs. S died, she gave the address, that is 46 Marconi Street, to her daughter and said to her that you can visit there and get back your things. But when the daughter reached there, Mrs. Darling did not recognize the girl. But the girl recognized that Mrs. Darling was wearing the same green knitted cardigan. The wooden buttons were pale from washing. And when Mrs. Darling got the idea that the girl has got recognized her, she half hid herself again behind the door. When the door opened and closed in the passage, it means Mrs. Darling failed to identify the girl and she closed the door. So when the door closed, a musty smell emerged. I regret I cannot do anything for you. I have come here especially on the train. I want to talk to you for a moment. It's not convenient for me now, said the woman. I can't see you any other time. She nodded and cautiously closed the door as though no one inside the house should be disturbed. I stood there where I was on the step. The curtain in the front of the bay window moved. Someone stared at me and would then have asked what I wanted. Oh, nothing, the woman would have said. It was nothing. I looked at the number plate again. Darling, it said. Means the correct name. In black letters on white enamel. And on the jamb, a bit higher, the number 46. Means the girl was on the right place. But Mrs. Darling was not ready to recognize the girl. As I walked slowly back to the station, I thought about my mother, who had given me the address years ago. It had been in the first half of the war. I was home for a few days and it struck me immediately that something or other about the rooms had changed. I missed various things. My mother was surprised. I should have noticed so quickly. Then she told me about Mrs. Darling. I had never heard of her, but apparently she was an old acquaintance of my mother, whom she hadn't seen for years. She had suddenly turned up and renewed their contact. Since then, she had come regularly. Every time she leaves here, she takes something home with her, said my mother. She took all the table silver in one go, and then the antique plates that hung there. She had trouble lugging those large vases, and I am worried she got a crick in her back from the crockery. My mother shook her head pityingly. I would never have dared ask her. She suggested it to me herself. She even insisted. She wanted to save all my nice things. If we have to leave here, we shall lose everything, she says. Have you agreed with her that she should keep everything, I asked. As if that's necessary, my mother cried. It would simply be an insult to talk like that. And think about the risk she is running each time she goes out the door with a full suitcase or bag. Now when the Mrs. Darling failed to recognize the girl, she moved back to the station. And when she was going back to the station, she reminisces about her mother and the first half of the war, when her mother gave all the essentials, or can say the house items, to this lady, like silver cutlery, tablespoon, antique plates, everything. Even the lady, Mrs. Darling, got difficulty while carrying those things, and she got a crick in her back while carrying the things. And when the girl asked her mother, or Mrs. S, she said that you don't know how much risk she takes while carrying these things. When she comes to us and take back those articles, you know, if those articles will be here, we will lose them. My mother seemed to notice that I was not entirely convinced. She looked at me reprovingly, and after that we spoke no more about it. Meanwhile, I had arrived at the station without having paid much attention to the things on the way. I was walking in familiar places again for the first time since the war, but did not want to go further than was necessary. I didn't want to upset myself with the sight of streets and houses full of memories from a precious time. So, the author's mother or the girl's mother was not ready to listen to anything. Meanwhile, the girl had reached the station, and as she was thinking about her mother, all the places which were around her were known places, known sights. But she did not want to upset herself. In the train back, I saw Mrs. Darling in front of me again, as I had the first time I met her. It was the morning after the day my mother had told me about her. I had got up late and coming downstairs, I saw my mother about to see someone out. A woman with a broad back. "This, my daughter," said my mother. She beckoned to me. The woman nodded and picked up the suitcase under the coat rack. She wore a brown coat and a shapeless hat. "Does she live far away?" I asked, seeing the difficulty she had going out of the house with the heavy case. "In Marconi Street," said my mother. "Number 46. Remember that." So when the girl was inside the train, again she thought of Mrs. Darling when she came in her house. And her mother introduced her to Mrs. Darling. You know, that lady, when she came there, she had she put the suitcase under the coat rack, and she wore a brown coat and a shapeless hat. The girl asked to her mother, "Does she live far away?" So her mother replied, No, in Marconi Street, and the number is 46. I had remembered it, but I had waited a long time to go there. Initially, after the liberation, I was absolutely not interested in all that stored stuff, and naturally, I was also rather afraid of it. Afraid of being confronted with things that had belonged to a connection that no longer existed, which were hidden away in cupboards and boxes, and waiting in vain until they were put back in their place again, which had endured all those years because they were things. But gradually, everything became more normal again. Bread was getting to be a lighter color. There was a bed you could sleep in unthreatened, a room with a view you were more used to glancing at each day. And one day I noticed I was curious about all the possessions that must still be at that address. I wanted to see them, touch, and remember. So when the girl was inside the train, she remembered the times that after the war, everything was free. No fear was there. The girl did not want to get back those things which were taken away by Mrs. Darling. But one day, she wanted to see them. She wanted to touch them. She wanted to remember her childhood days, her time which she spent with her mother. And this thing incited her to get back those things. So children, thank you. We will study this much only in today's video. Rest in next video.